guys, really excited for our German cooking class and even more excited to teach you guys a little bit about fermentation for this sauerkraut video. So sauerkraut is something that we usually use for 4th of July, but in Germany they put it on everything. It goes on brats, it goes on schnitzel, it goes as a side instead of just a topping. But it's really fun and it's kind of interesting the way they do it because you can impart your own flavors to it. A lot of times here in the US, we have just a straight fermented cabbage. But we're gonna have kind of my favorite spin on it today. So sauerkraut at the end of the day, basically the German translation is sour cabbage or sour herb. And so I'm just gonna kind of impart all of my favorite parts about this process to you guys as we go ahead. But the first thing, I went ahead and got a little bit started, but we're gonna cut some veggies together. So I have 2 heads of green cabbage. Just pretty small, they don't have to be massive. If you get a really big one, you can just use one. So I got my 2 heads and I quarter them each. And then they'll usually have a stalk that's a hard part that goes down the middle. We're gonna cut that out. And then we're basically just gonna slice this. You don't want to buy, I know sometimes in the lettuce section they have pre-shredded cabbage. You don't want to buy that because that usually has chemicals on it to stop it from browning. And those chemicals will also stop it from fermenting properly. So it's good to get fresh cabbage. I go green cabbage because it's a little more traditional, but you can use red cabbage if you want. It has a really pretty color to it too. But if you use red cabbage, anything else you put in it is going to be pretty bright pink. Just kind of break that up a little bit. The cabbage. And this is gonna make a lot with this recipe. It's gonna end up being about 10 cups once it's done fermenting and compiling together and becoming delicious. But like I said, traditional sauerkraut is usually just green cabbage and canning salt or some sort of fermentation activator, which canning salt is. But I really like to kind of cut a little bit of that sour and that acidity. I like to add some carrots, some parsnips, add a little bit more of a root vegetable vibe. Some people use apples. I try not to go with apples because though they have sweetness, they sometimes end up being pretty sour themselves. So I like to go with a white onion for it because white onions usually have a little bit more sweet to them, and it just adds a little bit of kind of a nice kind of sweet vibe for it. So then I'm taking 1 white onion, 2 heads of green cabbage, 1 white onion, and I did 3 pretty big carrots. And I just took that white onion, I just cut it into slivers. This is going to be basically fermenting between 1 week to 4 weeks. So even though they might be kind of slightly different sizes now, they're all gonna kind of mush together and really soften up a lot. So then my carrot, I peeled it, and I'm gonna cut them into pretty thin pieces. Because the carrot is the thickest consistency of all of our veggies we're using. Now, like I said, sauerkraut is something that they use a lot in Germany, and we oftentimes think of it as a German dish because the name itself is German. But it's actually thought that it came really more of like Central and Eastern European. So like Rome, it dates back to like Roman philosophers talked about sauerkraut and how basically, I don't know why I'm gonna start dicing that. Basically you end up, it ends up being dated back more to like Rome and Greece, and the Germans ended up coming in and taking it. But it's a common practice that came out of like medieval times is like pickling and fermenting things, and because it preserves your vegetables through the winter before refrigeration was really popular and you didn't have it in your home and ice was hard to come by. So if you could find ways to either dry goods or can them, or in this case, basically go through a fermentation process, it'll preserve them a lot longer, which makes it fun. So now I've got my carrots cut. So I've got my 2 heads of green cabbage, my 1 white onion, and my 3 carrots. And I'm gonna get a really big bowl, because obviously this is a lot. Pull this over here. I've got my large bowl, and basically once you use canning salt, it's gonna start the activation process. So canning and pickling salt is different from just a kosher salt. It ends up being, it has more of an activation process, whereas kosher salt adds a lot of flavor, but a lot of times it's been washed and rinsed enough that it's not gonna do anything to your food, so you're not worried about it making anything explode or start fermenting in the pan. But what's great about this is that it stops things like botulism. A lot of times when you have, what we're doing here is we're growing bacteria. And then as the acidity moves on, it will stop the bacteria growth. And a lot of times when you hear bacteria growth, you start worrying about botulism and things like that. But the canning salt will help kind of prevent that as well. So I'm taking my green cabbage and I'm putting it in the bowl. Then at a time. Take some white onions in there. Kind of break those up a little bit. And then I get my carrots. And it all ends up being kind of similar in size. So as that process continues, I'm gonna break it down a little bit. So I'm gonna do this in 2 batches. Set that aside. Get this. I'm gonna get 3 tablespoons of my canning salt. You guys will see when you look at it, it ends up being really fine. It's not like a kosher salt or a sea salt. It's gonna end up being a little bit more of like an iodized salt look. And take it, sprinkle it over the top. Another one. Sprinkle that over the top. And my third. And then I'm basically just gonna toss all of this together. And it's gonna start working on that cabbage. It's gonna start releasing liquid. Kind of messy, get your hands down in there. But even though you only use 3, you can feel that grit from the salt is getting all the way through the whole thing. It's pretty powerful stuff. But what ends up happening with sauerkraut is it goes through a lactic acid fermentation as opposed to like a pickling. It's very similar to what we think of as like kimchi. Traditional kimchi is made in a very similar way as sauerkraut because they both came around in that same time period in history where people were worried about preserving what they had. And this will go through a 3-part process. It's basically population dynamics of like the bacteria growing. So the first process is anaerobic bacteria starts the fermentation process, kicks it off. And that's the bacteria that normally if it's growing in something and it's not gonna be killed off, you wanna worry about. Because it gets things going, gets things moving. But it also, that's what sets the groundwork for all the flavor that's gonna come from this. Then the second process is the acid levels become high enough that it starts killing off that anaerobic bacteria and only more dynamic and stronger bacteria sticks around. And that bacteria is gonna make it harder for, like I said, that botulism to grow. And then the last one is the bacteria species that you've kept around that are really dominant. They're going to break down all the sugars in the cabbage, which is what this canning salt is doing as well. It's kind of getting in there, letting that sugar, and that's why it's starting to get more wet as I'm tossing it. But it's going to break down the last of those, that sugar, and it's going to further lower the pH of the whole thing. Which is fun maybe just for me, but I think it's really fascinating. And it's one of those things that you take a vegetable and you let it sit long enough with literally just salt, and it becomes this whole other dish. If you guys haven't, you should go watch our pickling video, because we do more of a quick pickling where you heat everything first to kind of jumpstart that process. But traditionally pickles were made in much the same way, where you just poured the vinegar over it and let it sit for a long time, sealed, and that's how things became pickled. So I'm now gonna start squeezing this because it's gonna have a lot of liquid that's gonna start coming out of it. And now there's 2 ways you can do this now. You can keep tossing it until it releases all the liquid possible, which usually takes about half an hour. or you can jump start it, and we are gonna make a little bit of a brine, which is salt and water. I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna add the rest of my flavors. So like I said, you guys can add veggies to it. You can kind of make it your own. But also in really traditional sauerkrauts, they use things like juniper berries, caraway seeds, cardamom you can end up using. I really like using my favorite, coriander, and also fennel seeds. I like the flavors of them. I think that the fennel seeds add a little bit of a sweetness to it. And you don't just get, I know when people think about fennel, they think like anise and licorice and it kind of turns them off to it, but it actually has really amazing sweetness to it, which I think is a lot of fun. So I'm going to use 2 teaspoons of fennel seeds. And I went ahead and went with the whole seeds. You can get ground, but if you do ground, just use 1 teaspoon. It's gonna be a little stronger flavor. And then I'm gonna match that. I'm gonna do 2 teaspoons of my ground coriander. And if you guys don't know, coriander is actually the dried version of cilantro. So if you're not big on cilantro, you might not be big on coriander. But I am big on both, and so I really like it. But again, that adds a little bit of a sweetness, and it adds a little bit of like kind of citrus notes to it. Or if you don't like cilantro, it adds a little bit of soapiness. And I'm gonna toss this. I don't know if you guys can see it, but you can see it's starting to be really wet. It looks more of like a slaw now, which is basically what we've just made. A really, really salty slaw. If any of you spent quarantine the way I think most of the population did, and you made sourdough, and if you did any sort of research about sourdough, there is a process of, if you guys make a really strong sauerkraut, and you take that old batch and you start making a new batch with it, it's similar to the way you do sauerkraut or sourdough, because it's like backdropping, where you're adding, so basically if you have a sourdough starter, that's your backdrop. That's your older batch that you've made, and then when you add flour and water back to it, that's like your new batch. And so you're basically feeding it, but it's a way to like temper flavors from things like your sauerkraut. So if you get a really acidic batch, you can kind of balance it out. So at this point, I'm gonna take any sort of glass container. I prefer one with a lid, but if you don't have one with a lid, that's completely fine as well, because we're gonna end up, you can drape a heavy towel over the top of it. You can put plastic wrap over the top of it. You want it to be able to breathe slightly, because you don't want it to kill all that bacteria that you're basically growing in there. But you also don't want it to just be open to the elements. Like I said, this will take, usually, you can get it in about a week and it'll start to have really good flavor, but the longer you let it sit, the more flavors are gonna build for it. It's gonna temper, if you take it just out after a week, it's gonna be really acidic and it won't have broken down all those sugars yet, because that's the 3rd step of the process. And so it'll be really sour, really tart, but you might not get some of that really nice sweetness to it as well. Put this guy in here. And as I'm putting it in, I'm pushing it down. Trying to get all that liquid to kind of rise to the top a little bit. So once this, if you guys leave it in, sorry guys, we had a slight technical difficulty. I'm not good. I panicked and I was like, it's making a noise. So you're basically going to let this go, I think anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks. And you guys can try it if you want to as it goes, but I usually check on it about 2 to 3 times a week, just to make sure it's still covered. Pushing it down. And then I've got all this liquid that's come to the bottom. And then because I've already added my salt, I'm gonna pour water over the top just to cover it. You want it to be completely submerged, and you want it to be about 1 inch underwater or brine. Get hot water. Get the last little bits of that from the container. Pour that in there. And then kind of press it down. Make sure the water is getting through it. It's about an inch under the water. And then this is the kind of tricky, creative part, is you want some sort of a weight. So when you make pickles, you want something that's going to hold them down underneath, because otherwise whatever's sitting on top is not gonna pickle. So whatever's sitting on top here isn't going to ferment the same as everything else. So we want to get some sort of a weight. So if you have an empty glass container that you can put on top that'll hold it down, that works. What I did is literally, this is just a Tupperware. It's full of water. It fits into the container just enough to make sure everything sits underneath. And I'm gonna cover it. And I'm not gonna seal it completely because it's obviously a ball jar, they're meant to be sealed, but I'm gonna put it on there enough that it can still breathe a little bit, but then you don't have to worry about it dying inside of there. And that's kind of a quick way about sauerkraut. We'll kind of offer updates as this process continues, but I hope you guys enjoy it. It's kind of a way that I think we take our kind of American bias of sauerkraut and you can make it kind of fun. People didn't use like pickles either, and now look, pickles are everywhere. So enjoy your sauerkraut, guys. Thanks for watching.